Hello, you can hear me. I feel like I'm wired to jettison into the universe right now. Thank you to Richard, thank you to everyone at Otago. I've been here for about 3 days now, and it's just incredible. Discovering this country, and more so discovering actually what's happening in food here is really, really exciting. So thank you again for hosting this. As said, I'm here today to share with you a little bit of my practice, as well as the personal journey I have been on to discover what food design is. So the title of what I'm going to talk about today is grandly called Food Is. And how I got there was through this. I think you can see this a bit. It is two very lovely pieces of cutlery and something in America that we call a Tootsie Pop. Who knows what a Tootsie Roll Pop is? Yeah, it's a sucker with a Tootsie Roll inside. So I use this slide because it's actually an example of how I grew up. So this fork and this knife are my mother's ancestors. My mom is French, my dad is American. And I grew up outside of Chicago. And my mother continued her French culture by cooking French cuisine in our home. And this was actually very rare in that time and place in the late 70s in America, where in the Midwest there was a lot of boxed food, there was a lot of eating at 5 p.m., leaving to go play sports afterwards. We were very rare in the way that we ate at 8 p.m., 3 plates, salad included, and then we sat down, we washed the dishes, we set the table for breakfast the next morning. Food was something that really started to define our family's identity and therefore our community, our culture. And as I grew up, and as you ultimately question who you are, what you belong to, I started to notice these differences. We would go to France in the summer, and I would see really different food ways that were occurring, different ways that people would gather around tables versus not gathering around tables. And so I started to wonder, is how we eat how we behave? And that is something that was always an undercurrent as I move forward in my life. So this is also not something that's very new. You know, since the dawn of man, we've gathered around food to exchange stories, to build cultures. And I think this is a kind of funny slide that I like to use, right? That in some ways we continue these behaviors for better or worse into modern day. So as I continued my path, I'm going to interject a little historical interlude here. I ended up, and as Richard said, I have a very, very plural path. I ended up in college studying modern dance, a form called Marthagram, and filmmaking. And though seemingly dichotomous areas of interest, actually, fundamentally, what I was interested in was telling stories. And I was interested in telling stories in space, in words, and in images. Mind you, being a headstrong 20-something-year-old, I left college and promptly decided that I wanted nothing to do with what I studied, and instead plummeted myself into photography. I had also grown up with a lot of photographers and had always had a camera. And little by little, I started looking, poking, and making stories myself. And that simultaneously also landed me as a waitress. You kind of have to pay for your art, right? So here I was, photographing away during the day, waitressing at night. And I ended up in these absolutely wonderful bars and restaurants in New York City at the beginning of kind of the gastronomic craze that now has swept New York City. And some of the chefs found out that I had a camera, that I could take pictures, and they said, well, you should take pictures of the food. And so I began. And I began looking and wondering and seeing what food was, how it existed, both on a plate, but by working in these environments, also how it functioned communally and socially in this mini theater of life that I was a part of. And I kind of fell in love with that space. It was, like you saw that first slide, it was a way to tell stories in all these different dimensions, from something that we were looking at, something that we were sharing, that we were smelling, that we were touching. And to make a very long story short, I took the elevator the wrong way. I thought I was going to study interior design. The elevator went up instead of down, and the floor opened, and it was something called industrial design. And so here I had discovered truly my calling. So I decided to get a master's degree in industrial design at Pratt Institute. And I did. And I left. And I actually made all of this. So I practiced for 5 years as a classically trained industrial designer, working from flat screen TVs for Panasonic to ping pong tables for Puma. I even went to China and made a baby stroller. Yes, I did. It's right there. And through all of it, it was just this cacophony of creativity. Here I was discovering processes, materials, forms, studying people, understanding what their needs were, designing a form that would suit their needs. It was a creative explosion. And for a few years, I was really engaged and really excited. But something happened in the middle of that. I lost myself. I was doing a lot of work for other people. I was looking outwards all the time. But something inside was missing. And I asked myself this question: where did I go? Where did I go in the middle of all of this creativity? I had studied design because I loved working with other people. I loved using my hands. I loved collaboration. But there was some kind of motivation that suddenly was missing. And as I worked on projects and the scales got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, I got emptier and emptier and emptier and emptier. And so I had to make a choice. What do I do? So I think we all know this great French gastronome, Brillat Savarin. I was perusing through articles one day, and of course this classic, now almost cliched quote comes up: "Show me what you eat and I will show you who you are." And at that moment, that quote very, very much resonated with me, as had food all throughout my life. It truly had defined the fundamental parts of my behavior and my identity. So I thought, well, here I am. I'm trained as a designer. I'm trained in materials. I'm trained in processes. What if food became the material of my investigation? But the interesting thing as a designer is that I'm actually not trained in what. We are not trained in what. We are trained in how. And so that really was the question at hand. So I said, well, show me how you eat and I will show you who you are. And so I decided that I would try to investigate how food could be a material in my personal design practice. So I'm going to share with you a few examples of what I've discovered along the way. And I started very close to home. This is a great thing to open up a conference with. Oh yes, I decided while I was working in a job to take on a variety of projects, kind of different competitions, art gallery shows, just to test and poke how this material affected my practice. And so I started here. I started with an artifact, some sort of symbol that would show me who I was and perhaps share with the world a bit of who I was. And there was a really wonderful Jell-O competition that had been launched in Brooklyn. And you were supposed to enter and you could make anything, but it had to be in Jell-O. So here I was, absolutely certain of the fact that everyone was going to show up with this. This is a bad resolution of it, but it is my left breast cast in Jell-O. Yep. I was totally sure that everyone would show up with some kind of salacious jiggling thing, right? No, these were all designers. They all showed up with like electronic Jell-O amplifiers and turkey light bulbs made of Jell-O, and here I showed up with my left breast. But I had done it. And as you know, sometimes you have to listen to your material. And the material had said, this is part of you that you're giving to the world. So this was a very symbolic act. And I followed through on that symbolism, even in the process of it. So the flesh itself is made of hand-squeezed peach juices. I squeezed everything. This had to be about me. This had to be about my body as technology, my body as process. Hand-squeezed peach juice, hand-squeezed watermelon juice. And inside, there's a little round of lapsang souchong panna cotta. If you know what lapsang souchong is, it's sort of this dirty, smoky tea. So the idea was that you would cut through this thing, and then you'd end up in this kind of dirty milk. Ooh. Proving the provocation at play through taste. So it was received with question, and people did actually eat it. And I did not die, which was also a great, great reward. So that first step had been taken. And I had risked personal vulnerability and had actually been okay and received rather well. So it was time to take the next step. Now, little did I know that really what I had made was a sketch model. In design terms, that's what you do. You're ideating, you're making something, what does it look like? I go out and I give it to the world. But what I had not done was my research. So I decided to engage that. And I decided to look at food as memory. Right? Food is one of these ripe, ripe, ripe materials. And due to its sensory stimulation, it actually globs onto our memory. So it's very subjective for each of us. We have a high amount of stimulation around food, which means that we have very, very full, ripe memories for it. So what did people think about food around me? I took another opportunity, otherwise known as design research, and I made this. Now, this is a mobile sound booth that I called the Food Bank. It was for an exhibition in Brooklyn. And the food bank was open to participants to come in, and I asked them to record their favorite food memories. You'd walk in, you'd flip a switch, and you would tell me what your favorite food memory was. And it was a way to start recording the oral histories around me, and also start to gather some information of what food meant to people. How did it resonate with them? What was important in this landscape of food around me? And these were tools that I had learned as a designer, tools that I had learned in my process. The first thing that you do is you look. You look, you ask, and you question. So here was an interactive way to build this into my practice and to start gathering more information. And the ultimate goal of this project was to create sort of a virtual cookbook in which you could search not just for recipe, but for ingredient, emotion, and location. So to start to create a different kind of vocabulary around food and our food histories. And what came from it were a ripe, ripe, ripe collection of really interesting and wonderful personal narratives. And yet, I was still on my journey here. And as I was thinking about it and listening to these, another opportunity came up. And it was highly informed as I was working through this. I was hearing a lot of these pieces of memories that actually became traditions in people's lives. They would say, oh, my mother used to make this kind of potato, and now I actually make this kind of potato, but I add a little bit of this and this. So through the food bank, I started to hear oral histories and then actually discover that they were evolving and growing, just as cultures and communities naturally do. So what did that mean for me as a maker on this journey? I started to make more sketch models. And I started actually with this. Now, you heard that my mother cooked as a French person. Also, so no American junk food was allowed in our home. And oh, it's not great for you, but it's so delicious. So here was this childhood dream that I was faced with, right? And as I was listening to all these food memories of Americans, I was hearing all these things that I'd never gotten to eat that sounded really good. And in the office I was working in, you actually got a lot of free snacks. So these things were around every now and then, and I would sort of pick at them and poke at them. And while I'm going through this process, a friend of mine who runs core77.com, which is a very large industrial design website, was making something called the Hack to Work Special. So it was like back to school, back to work. How are different ways that you could hack your office day and make it more interesting and engaging for you? So here I was in the midst of my personal identity seeking, and he said, Emily, will you make something? Just do something that you're interested in doing. Okay, I'm listening to the food memories. I should remake something around food. Yes, I will use junk food. Well, mind you, I made Office Snack Gourmet, how to turn junk food into something more. So I decided to make an actual example of how I had grown up and how I had started to evolve. So I took these classic gastronomic recipes I had grown up with and gave myself the material constraints of remaking them, but only using American junk food. So I made 5 for this website, and they were absolutely wonderful. They actually were. As you see a little piece here, truffled berry pralinate purses that are made with fruit roll-ups, the inside of a Snickers bar, and crushed potato chips. Totally delicious for snack. And what happened is that my sketch models, right, went into the world, and the internet found them, as well as a book publisher. And that book publisher was Adams Media, a division of F&W Media, a large book publisher in America. And I got a phone call, and the phone call said, hello, Emilie Baltz. We found your junk food recipes online. Oh, have you ever thought of making a book? I had made 5 recipes on my backyard porch, right? Yes, of course I've thought of making a book. Wonderful. Can you make 101? Absolutely. Okay, we'll send over a contract. Oh no, I was in trouble. So I got a book publisher, and he whittled it down to 51 recipes, and I quit my job. And I made this, Junk Foodie, 51 delicious recipes for the lowbrow gourmand, that actually took those sketch models and made them into final prototypes refining them into everything from petit breakfasts to les lunches to the grand dîner to amuse-bouche, dessert, and even cocktails. And what it did was it started to look at the material culture around me, the material culture that I had not been a part of, but was fascinated by, and poke and push and develop techniques around manipulating those materials to create new forms of gastronomy, new food designs, if you have it. Things like the Twinkie Napoleon showed up, if you know what the Napoleon is, right? It's this wonderful puff pastry that is classically French. It's puff pastry and pastry cream, and you like bite into this thing and it's crispy and squishy and sweet and kind of salty. I decided to use the Twinkie and the potato chip. So you can cut the Twinkie in half. You know what a Twinkie is? It's like cake with cream shot into it. And the Twinkie can last mythically for 250 years because it has so many stabilizers and emulsifiers into it. In and of itself, a fascinating piece of food design. But the wonderful thing about the material properties of a Twinkie is that if you take the cream out and you reserve it, the cake, if you squish it, it reconstitutes very easily into dough. And then you can roll it out and manipulate it, which I did. So the Twinkie Napoleon, you can try this at home. You roll out the cake into very thin slices of dough, and then you take the reserved cream, add it, smash potato chips into little smithereens, add it on top, layer, repeat. And what you have is a tiny little morsel, actually, but it's a transformation that I promise you tastes just like a Napoleon. I also made a very berry jelly belly clafoutis. The jelly belly is like the bouillon cube of junk food. It gives you all these other flavors that you don't have and really need. It also gets you away from the sort of beige color palette that it all has. This here is a circus peanut aron, kind of hitting the macaron phase a little early. This is a circus peanut with the inside of a Mounds bar and Fun Dip mixed together. So you get a little bit of citric acid. So you're balancing all this sugar and making it a rounder flavor. So Junk Foodie was loads of fun. It very much was a pop culture product. And then I decided to take it another step further and involve people. So I did Junk Foodie workshops in which junk food was brought and you were able to invent your own junk food recipe. This is Cullen. He made handy cool matches with Handy Dip, I think some sort of Red Hots, Cheese Whiz, and Doritos. But what happened through Junk Foodie was a great lesson, is that actually this is what I had started to do. I had started to connect food, product, and people. I had made a food product, I had made a book that told its story, and then I involved other people in the recreation and evolution of that. And that was something that showed me that really this is what it was. That food functioned as community. And it was a really wonderful way to start expressing creativity, bring other people into it, and use these same interests that I had had in design and design processes and start to apply them to a personal practice. And serendipitously, another project showed up. And this project was in 2011. It was a pop-up restaurant called What Happens When, that was a collaboration with chef John Fraser in New York City and Ella Kunos, who runs the Metrics Design Group, an interior design firm. And together, John actually proposed the project, and he said, I want to make a pop-up restaurant. Now, pop-up restaurants, though now kind of the lingua franca of much food creation, was very new then. There weren't a lot of pop-up restaurants in New York City. John really wanted to get out of the kitchen. He wanted to explore his creativity in greater ways. So he said, let's literally do that. Get me out of the kitchen. I want to do a temporary restaurant. So we decided to do this together, but push it a little bit further. With this idea of collaboration, with this idea of community in mind, how could we actually take our process and turn it inside out? So traditionally, restaurants have been run, they're chef-directed, food-driven. What would happen if we started the other way? What would happen if we started to look at it through the lenses of sound and of design that would start to inform food? So we termed it, as you see here, What Happens When. And the idea was what happens when a chef gets out of the kitchen? What happens when design starts to inform the food? What happens when we start to look around and realize that all of our senses are stimulating how we eat and what we eat? And to do that, we funded it through an organization called Kickstarter, which I think we're all familiar with by now. Kickstarter was in the early phases. We were one of the first food projects on Kickstarter. And I saw this platform, a funding platform, and said, how interesting, here's a patronage model, a classic patronage model that's reinventing itself. So we're, in a sense, trying to reinvent the restaurant form. So how could we take that idea of reinvention, this idea of collaboration, and extend it to all parts of the design process, including perhaps the funding? And so we put What Happens When up on Kickstarter, and we asked for financial support, but we also asked for creative support. So all of our patrons who were helping fund us could also send in an idea for a theme. Because the interesting part about What Happens When is it was to last for 9 months, and every month a new theme would be explored. So the interior design would change, the sound design would change, and the menu would change, exploring exactly that, what happens when. And the results were astounding. We ended up raising over $25,000 to fund our design budget. And off we went. And we got a space in Lower Manhattan that was a former French restaurant and cleared the inside, painted it all black as a black box, and started with the first movement, as we called them. Now, you saw earlier, I developed a system of iconography. So each of these icons was a different movement of the restaurant, a different 30 days. So in a sense, this iconography would attach itself to a different sound, a different interior design, a different menu, serving as symbols of this new lexicon of taste that we were exploring. So our first movement was very simple and very foundational. You were in our house. That was that little house that you saw. And we had cleared all of the inside of the restaurant and painted it black, just like a black box theater, and strung the ceiling with 400 hooks. And then we took our architectural drawings, mapped them onto the floor in 1-to-1 scale, onto the walls, and onto the ceiling with a reflected ceiling plan. So you walked in and you were in the drawings. You were in the foundation. The menu that first movement was very ingredient-driven, Scandinavian-inspired. The soundtrack was very cold, a little icy. The second movement, we got in a suggestion for Where the Wild Things Are, the children's book. So what would it feel like to be in this childhood fantasy forest? And we took this space, you can't see it very well here, but the entire space was covered with this abstract forest, which were green sticks and volumes that would go across the ceiling. Little vignettes with moss swings, moments of almost literal representations of forestry. Animal tracks ran across the table. The meal, this movement, was very dark, game flavors, wild foods. The colors were dense, the textures were dense. The soundtrack here was actually a more modern kind of pop version of jungle rhythms. So all of these things were coming together as we really were exploring and poking and experimenting at what actually food experience was. Our third movement was inspired by Renoir's Boat Party, and we did just that. We remade the awning with these handmade light bulbs, candles. The food for this movement was inspired by a deconstructed French picnic. And then we came back home for the next movement, and we started to look at New York City, and we looked at the sounds and the tempos and the rhythms that were inspiring in New York City. And something that often is thought of is jazz. And so we took this theme and we actually translated it not into literal representations of jazz, but tempo and movement and rhythm. So if you can see here, the ceiling is actually strung with string that moves up and down in all of these linear formats. There are large abstract shapes that are abstracted instruments that served as light fixtures. And the food for this movement was classically American. Big porterhouse steaks, double-baked potatoes, creamed spinach. All of it was to remember and hearken kind of this era of fundamental Americana. And then the dramatic interlude, we lost our liquor license. I believe here there is such a thing as community boards as well. If you've ever come into contact with them, they're exciting. So unfortunately, we lost our liquor license, and as designers, we made this, which was a prohibition campaign, so we printed our own newspapers, went out, tried to get it back. We stayed open for another month serving juice. That was not very fun. So we unfortunately had to close our doors several months early, but we'd actually had prepared the next movement, and it was to be this, and it was inspired by the Spice Road. So this is what you would have eaten within. Now I move to this statement because throughout this community building, throughout all of these crazy design charrettes, don't ever try to do this project, by the way, that was so hard. But really what had emerged is that food functioned as a community, but it also, for it to function efficiently, functioned as a system. And this is something that we talk a lot about in design and in design practices. What are the systems that are at play? And while doing What Happens When, I simultaneously was working on this. So this is a street food cart in New York City. This is on 34th Street. And I had been approached by 34th Street because this was a problem for them. And it was 34th Street Business Improvement District that is in charge of the beautification of their neighborhood. And they said, listen, we have this issue. We make beautiful benches, we make beautiful garbage cans, we make beautiful bus stops. The one thing that we can't really touch are these, the food carts. And food carts are iconic in New York, right? There are hot dogs, there are pretzels, there are hot dogs. And if you've walked past them this summer, they smell of hot dogs, hot dogs, hot dogs. So how can we mediate that? We don't think that this is helping the public experience or the urban space. We would like to engage you, Emilie, to go on a research mission and help us define what this landscape is, define what this system is. And so in winter, I actually embarked on this. And so 34th Street actually spans many, many blocks, almost about 25 blocks in New York City. And about 94 food vendors occupy these spaces. And so I went out with a collaborator, Sinclair Scott Smith, and we ended up mapping the entire neighborhood, morning, noon, and night, to understand where food vendors lived, where they worked and sold, what their habits were. We made a book, we photographed them, locations, times of sale. We built a system map through our findings that said, here is how food vending works in the New York City public landscape. We have garages where food carts get parked. Those garages are really interesting because, oh, we didn't know this, but food distribution happens there. Food gets shipped there, food cart owners buy the food there, and off they go out into the landscape. They also get washed there and cleaned there. By being able to map this using a design process, we were able to find an area of opportunity. And so instead of actually addressing the carts themselves, it seemed to be more interesting to try to address the garage owners. And so I did just that. Ended up meeting Hatem Baker, who's pictured here in the center, who happened to be a garage owner, but also a food cart owner. So he was kind of a double whammy. And with him, we spoke to him about our project and decided that together we would try to prototype a new kind of food cart and a new kind of food system vending in New York City. And so we ended up transforming this into this. So something that had sold industrially produced hot dogs now was selling fresh fruit juices, fresh fruit smoothies on the streets of New York City. We brought design skills to it and redesigned it. We even named it Project Food Carts. So it was a beginning of a project for both city beautification, but also food system planning, and trying to reintroduce new ways of eating in the public landscape. Now, another part of my practice, and I'm going to deviate into, is throughout all these, throughout community building, throughout system development, something happens with food, and it's kind of what's happening right now, right? I'm up here giving you a show in one way or another. But we go into restaurants, we do these meals together, and there's performance that's going on, right? It is, as I said early on, it is the theater of life. And I was actually born, my mother was a Montessori teacher and my father was an actor when I was born. So underlying, there's always been a certain interest within this. And while doing this project, I've often was approached by various different institutions, and the Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center had approached me to ask if I would make a dinner. And a choreographer named Ralph Lemon was giving a premiere performance of a new piece of choreography. And the theme of the choreography was to look and question the walls of the theater, to ask, where does performance exist? Can it exist outside of the theater? And if so, how? And so the curator of the performance wanted to have a dinner that would facilitate the same discourse. So he said, here's the topic at hand. What do you think? What would you make? So I developed this, which is a 40-person spandex dinner table. Now, why spandex? You will soon see. So this is inside of a theater at MPAC, the Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center. And it spanned the theater. So you went into a black box theater. Again, we find ourselves within this trope. And the light changed over the course of the evening from dawn until dusk. And it changed ever so subtly as people sat in it. Oh! What happened? And then the curtain went up. Dramatic pause. I don't think I pushed anything strange. This is actually exactly what it all looked like. No? No, I don't know. I don't think it's working. Is it working? No. I think all power just went down. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the spandex table then. So this thing that you saw, it had peaks and it had valleys, right? And the idea with this table was to look at the notion of stage. Right? So I've often wondered about this. And in French, it's interesting because there's a word plateau, right? So plateau is the tray that you bring to the table. Plateau also means stage. So this is a very interesting relationship that's at play, literally. And when I was presented with the topic of the performance, I started to think about this and thought, well, if the table is our stage for a dining performance, and here we are in a theater watching a performance, and we're asking, how do we start to look beyond the walls of the traditional space in which performance is created? What if the table was not a table, but a table? So those peaks and those valleys, the top peaks are hard. Glasses can go up there, liquids. The valleys are soft. And what happens is that, first of all, you sit in this spandex stretch chairs, spandex table, and you're a bit suspended. So all parts of your body are gently touched, and you're actually sort of in a new physical space, right? You don't have the same physical touch points anymore than you do with a chair and a table. No, everything is sort of loose and suspended. So you're slightly cradled, first of all, by the form. Second of all, what happens is that within those valleys, the food starts to get plated. And as the food got plated throughout that lunar landscape, depending on where it was, it would move in different ways. So it would bounce and it would jiggle and it would kind of slide sometimes. And so the food danced. And so it performed for you instead of you performing for it. So the notion with that piece was to start to look at it and say, how do we use design, how do we use the objects of our design to create a new food experience and to touch on these kinds of thematics that are at play within this conversation. And hopefully by doing that, you start to create a more full experience, a more full understanding of the topic at hand. And I will tell you that no one spilled anything. The table was quite pristine. And a very delicate sort of lovely feeling was at play as you were suspended through this meal and as your food started to bounce and to move. And while the light changed from dawn until dusk, the shape of the table therefore changed. Now I'm back. I feel like I should jeter across the stage. Just due to shadow play, right? As color temperatures changed, those peaks and those valleys took on different shapes. If you've ever drawn, they're simple principles, right? Or photographed. You just change the light and your object changes, right? You give it completely different characteristics. So here were very simple ways to be able to apply form, color, line, material, and experience into food. So in essence, those were using all classic design techniques and then bringing them full forward into a food experience. Do you think this thing will go back down?
An overload triple power, so it's got the power out here.
Oh.
That's why I asked if the microphone's still going for the secret system.
Ah. Now it's going. Now a status message. I overloaded the system? I wasn't even yelling. And I'll give you a little secret too while we wait for the screen to come back on. So that table was made in case any of you ever want to make a spandex table at home. So it's mixing bowls. So it's big, just kitchen mixing bowls that are convex and concave. And little did you know that actually The mixing bowl, the kind of typical medium-sized mixing bowls, are the same top diameter as large IKEA plates. So you can register them if you want. So if you didn't want it to bounce, you could slide it into this mixing bowl. If you did want it to bounce, you would slide it between. So it was something that quite performative, right? But with very, very simple materials. And the bowls were glued to the table. And, wow. Now we're doing it. Yeah. So, as the lights descend, I will also share with you one thing I could not talk about. These are the napkins. So, these are circular napkins that were in front of everyone's spot, and they're laser cut with their name in them. And so, as you walked into the experience, it's gone, but you would see your name projected across the surface. And a very nice anecdote is that as you're standing there, you know, quite nervous about this whole thing that's about to take place, a woman walks past and asks the man that she's walking in with, "Have you found yourself yet?" To which he replied, "No." So you can see here a few more images of it, and you'll see that in these different moments, though what seems to be a straight surface is actually quite responsive. And the food was prepared in collaboration with a longtime collaborator, Jose Ramirez Ruiz, and Pamela Young, who have a pop-up restaurant called Chez Jose in Brooklyn, soon to be a permanent restaurant. Now, everything that I've talked about in this last example definitely speaks of objects in motion, right? All these things are moving. And choreography is just that, right? It's the relationship between objects in motion. And my background in dance has led me to a great interest in how the body moves and how things move. And nowhere do we see that better than the choreography of meals and of restaurants. Anyone who's ever run them knows that this is, having to script all of these moving parts together is one of the greatest challenges. So to abstract this and to think about it, I had a long time ago made this drawing. This is dancing on a table. I had really wanted to do that kind of feeling of like, sometimes you just need to do things. So I did. So this is me zinging through avocado. And this was a first test project. I said, I have this drawing for years. It's been sort of nibbling at the back of my mind. I'm really interested in exploring dimensions of food and how it can be a material for my practice. So what if I just did it? And I did. And so I made this photograph. So choreography, object, object, motion. Simple. Interesting picture. Interesting picture. This is the skin of an avocado to 220 times magnification. I had discovered this other tool. And what happened is that I put them together and decided to make this. And this is an experiential dining performance. It's a choreography of objects in motion. Now, taking from it, and this is an abstract process that I'm going to walk you through, but it ends up becoming rather stimulating as an experience. So a friend of mine put together a really wonderful experience called Monkey Town, in which you ate inside of immersive video experience. It's a 4-channel video cube that people eat inside of. We're looking at the outside of it right now at I-Beam Gallery in New York City. And he proposed that I could have a night to do a performance in. I said, wonderful. Aha, the dancing on the table, whoosh, table up. Yeah, let's do it. So I installed a table over here, which was a light table, onto which I did exactly just that, except the drama had to heighten. So we started first with the dancing of the skin of the ingredients. And so what you see here is the magnification of up to 220 times that I did of the ingredients of the first course of the diners. And so as they were eating their food, these hyper-sized ingredients were floating around them. Everything that was on the plate suddenly had a new dimension in sight. So now we had 2 objects in motion. We had human, we had ingredient. The second course took that to another level and said, okay, now our performer will smash through them. So I danced through the second course of ingredients. So as the diners are eating, the food around them and a body around them are moving. So now we have a collision of ingredient and of body. Those were tomatoes. And last but not least, I went inside of the cube. So up until now, no one had known that this was a live performance. And here we are eating and seeing different magnifications of the scale of the ingredients around us. But are we actually looking at each other around us? What is the relationship between these two objects that are actually in motion within this cube? So to emphasize that point, I went into the cube and explored all the eaters. And what happens when you put a microscope of 220 times magnification to someone's scalp? That. Or their eyeball? That. Or their mouth? And what started to happen is that though the entire experience had been built around this outside surface that was around us, about everything that is around us when we eat as we're looking out and out and out, by actually pointing the microscope at each other, people started acknowledging and looking at each other and started talking to each other and then revealing parts of themselves otherwise not revealed. Like when they came up and said, I want to look at this. What's that? Well, that's where my boyfriend cut me. And here we are in this space together, facilitated by Emilie, sharing very, very, very intimate stories, very vulnerable spaces that are actually quite safe because we've orchestrated and choreographed a movement to get to that space together. And it's actually one of the most moving experiences that I have had the privilege of being a part of. Now taking those learnings and actually saying, well, what now lacks from this? We've looked at it in two-dimensional space. What if we could actually touch it? So these are excerpts from a meal called Traces, in which the food, just as you saw in the video cube, being moved and smashed by an omniscient performer, actually gets to be done by you. So the food is served directly onto the surface in front of you. And here you'll see the first course. Hands were put open and sauce was drizzled right over them. So the only thing you can do is, you're stuck now. You've got to use your hands. So the whole meal is served with no utensils and you only use your hands. So courses would grow and develop. And the notion of this was to start to try to codify these traces, just as we had done in the video cube at that very last course. That sparked something. And said, well, what if we could trace and what if we could facilitate this kind of conversation, but actually through the food material itself? And so Traces did just that. People had to share and break and rip things and take sauces and glob them over. They would touch each other. They would grab sauce from another person. And more and more and more, as we started to use our body as a tool for eating, we started to create new connections within each other and perhaps even new connections within ourselves as we touched and felt and smelled our kind of most primitive space as human, our bodies. And what comes out of it is actually these very abstract canvases that are representations of these traces, of our communications and of our meals shared together. And there are the last few projects with you that kind of bring more of these into vocabulary and into contemporary landscape as well. And as you go through these projects, you see, and I think the video cube is an emotional project, right? These images that are made through traces, they say something, like there is emotion within these spaces. And we all cook and we all share food together because it just feels good. And a project that I've been working on for the last few years simultaneous to all this work was to open a bar for the Museum of Sex, which I will conclude with. And within this, I was looking at a lot of emotions, right? And the lingua franca of that institution would be, well, you should, of course, make a bar about aphrodisiacs, right? Ugh, yawner. Have you ever read those stories? They're like still from Greco-Roman times. And we're looking at then Casanova, who's still eating 100 oysters because it's good for his libido, blah, 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 blah. Are they the stories of today? Do these things make sense to still be telling ourselves very, very old myths about the foods that we desire? I was curious about that. And as one makes and looks and sees that there are new narratives evolving every day at every table everywhere in the world, I wanted to give form to this and give vocabulary to it. So I embarked on this and asked 15 different chefs and mixologists to create recipes that were their definitions of love. Not desire, but love. believing that love is a bit more of a singular emotion and love is a more complex system of emotions, which is perhaps more representative of the world that we live in today. And that interrogation ended in this, the love food book, the Libertinage Gourmand, which is a book that came out about 1.5 years ago in France. And it collects all of these stories, all of these recipes from chefs and mixologists, and presents them in a very large art cookbook format. And I went around and photographed all of these and designed the whole book. And I'll share with you a few of them now. And one of the most poignant was from a chef in Belgium, Kobe Desrameltz, who has a restaurant called In de Wolf. And In de Wolf is the farm, actually, that Kobe grew up in. When we asked Kobe, what is your definition of love? He said this, sacrifice. And this is what it is. So these are 2 pigeons. And Kobe in the farm, which is now his restaurant, had grown up with pigeons. And he had these 2 pigeons that were his friends, and he would talk to them, and he would play with them, and gave them names, and he saw them grow. They were his friends. And one day his mother came to him, and she said, Kobe, we have to kill the pigeons. And he said, why? She said, because we have to eat. And so his first definition of love was sacrifice. And to this day, he has this incredible dish on his menu, which is pigeon. And the pigeon is stuffed with hay. It sits and it ferments for several weeks. And in doing so, the meat deconstructs. It takes on a bit of a bitter flavor, becomes very soft. And then he cooks it in hay butter. And when you eat this dish, it is that emotion. It is this feeling of sacrifice, of kind of bitter-sweet nostalgia that he tasted as his first moment of love. Then I went back to Chicago and worked with the chef Richard Farina, who's at Moto Restaurant there. And I asked Richard what love was, and he said, love is discovery. And this is it. Now this is a log that's this big. There's a little scone, little root vegetables on top of it. All these microgreens, dehydrated peas, tapioca maltodextrin mixtures. And as you walk through this thing with your hands, you're looking, your scale goes from here to here. And due to the scale change, due to the design of this dish, you actually are forced to discover little by little the minutia and the splendor and the magic that is in that dish. And he said, that for me is what love is. You have to pay attention. Going back to Brooklyn, I worked with the chef Ignacio Matos, who was at Isa Restaurant at that moment. Ignacio is from Uruguay. He's quite a passionate chef. Really, really talented and wonderful. And he said, for me, this is love. I love to cook. I love it. It is my passion. I adore it. And I have to do it every day, and I must do it well every day. And so this is how you make love. Now, this is a steak tartare. It's awesome. It's one of my favorite steak tartares ever. This is rye flax soil with crème fraîche and a juniper berry. And you mix this thing up, and it's just delicious, gooey steak tartare, kind of the crunchy flax and bread soil, the juniper berry, and the cream. Boom. And it's a delicious dish. And he said, yes, so to make this every day, what I need to do is I need to create boundaries. Because I work with people of all skill levels. And I need it to look like this over and over and over again. So you can appreciate it aesthetically and also in terms of flavor and taste. He said, so what I do? Molds. You make a mold. And in the creation of those boundaries, he was actually able, therefore, quite simply, to replicate his love and his passion. And the last one is from a chef, Ben Roche, who was also at Moto Restaurant as a pastry chef. And I asked Ben if he would contribute several recipes. He said, yeah, I want to make a cocktail. I'm a pastry chef. I'm going to make a cocktail. And that's it. So this is a gin jelly. And in the center of it is a pine berry. If you've ever had a pine berry, it's like an albino strawberry, and it tastes of bubble gum. And this is a piece of micro rhubarb on the top of it. And this thing, though quite big on screen, is this big. And so everything that happens is when you put this little thing in your mouth, what is a solid becomes liquid, what is fruit becomes candy. All of this shifting of perception is what Ben believed love to be. And that was a moment of surprise. So the last project that I shared with you, I talked briefly about. The beginning of the Love Food book was inspired by this ongoing work that I'd done with the Museum of Sex, which was to look at the relationship between food, emotion, and desire. And in doing so, and in making the book and in bringing to life these stories, started to create greater shape for the commercial project I was working on as well. And so food now is taking on all these different dimensions. Now there was a language around it. Now what if that language applied to place? And what if it was playfully applied to place in all ways? So in this last fall, we opened Play, which is a bar and cafe at the Museum of Sex. And Play takes you kind of through this adventure from day until night, from flirt to fetish, through a series of different alcoves that you can sit in with salacious books next to you. You have moments of privacy, and then you have moments of public. In the back are large banquettes. This really beautiful bar from the 19th century is installed in the back. We worked with a wonderful architect, Eric Maylander, to put this together. And so Play serves as this playground of saying, okay, we've discovered these things along the way. How do we put them into action? And when you go through the Museum of Sex, you give yourself permission. You give yourself permission to look. You give yourself permission to learn. You can't really give yourself permission to touch, right? It's kind of weird. So what if there is a way within a cultural institution to bring that information to life? And within this context, it's difficult to imagine what that could be, but what if there was a playful lens onto it? And so what if all of these emotions and feelings were available in front of you, and you could poke and touch and lick through food and drink? And that's what we developed. So here's a brief peek at some of the flavors and colors and textures, things that are creamy, things that are crispy, things that are a little powdery to tickle your nose. Right? All of the food was intentionally chosen to start looking at our sensory experience and saying, what are all the points of stimulation within our bodies? Alongside of that, I was asked to curate an experimental cocktail menu and brought different artists to the table to use art to create new points of entry into desire through drink. And so this is a cocktail. This is actually a black plate designed in collaboration with the artist Bart Hess. And Bart is originally trained as a textile artist, and he makes these absolutely stunning, stunning materials. And I had asked Bart to work on lick, because these were kind of the constraints of the curation. Licking, sucking, biting, and sniffing. All these things you do in intimacy, you actually also do in food. So what if we played with that relationship? And so I said, Bart, work on lick. And so he came up with this idea. That's a plate that is ribbed like this textile, and it comes with a vial of white goo. The white goo is actually nagori sake yuzu gel that then is poured onto the plate. And so what happens is, as you can see here, the texture becomes a little bit more apparent. And as this plate is placed in front of you, a black plate on a black table, you have nothing other to do but lick. And so you're faced with all of these people around you who are licking. A very childlike act, right? But a permission to let yourself feel something, to let yourself laugh, to let yourself open up to this sensory space that food embraces so, so, so well. I also talked about means of production. And as you remember early on with the Jell-O boob, there was something about using the body to make that was interesting. And this is a coming soon cocktail designed with artists Baltz and Parr, who are in London. And they really wanted to work on squish. And so they originally came to the table and said, we have this great idea. We want to make this cocktail where you'll be sitting in the bar, and then the waiter will come to you with grapes, and you'll have to get your feet washed and then massaged and oiled, and then you'll smash the grapes, and then the waiter will take the grapes away, and then the grape juice will go into your drink, and you'll be drinking the juices of your own feet. Yes! No, not in commercial food service. That's a disaster. So instead, what if we take that idea and take this notion of, it's a fetishized experience in many ways, and actually bring some celebrities into it. So this is Alan Cumming, who is smashing grapes. He's a movie actor in America. This is Catherine Crockett, who's one of the lead dancers of Martha Graham, who actually did it on point. And so you get all of these archetypes, the dancer, the actor, there's a reality TV star, there's more, etc., etc. And you have them smash these grapes, right? And we take the grapes, distill, reduce them, conserve the juice of the grapes, And then you're actually served the cocktail with the juice of their feet in it while watching a video of their performance. So in a way, we're taking this idea of mediated fetish, of looking beyond. It's actually a form of pornography called crush porn, that you watch people smash things with their feet, and reenacting it here, but actually offering a point of entry into that experience just through a product design, which is a food design. So this licking thing got me very excited. And I took this experience and said, this is so fun, and people are happy, and they're liberated, and they're laughing. And at heart, that's really what food is it is joyful. It's not something that we do with drudgery, hopefully. It never should be. It's a great celebration to be able to feed ourselves every single day and should be treated as such. So this is a personal project called Lickestra. And Lickestra is just that. It's a licking ice cream orchestra. This was developed in collaboration with Carla Diana, who's a smart object designer and artist. So Carla works at the intersection of technology and design, and I work at the intersection of food and design. And we had applied for a residency together. We are long friends and had always wanted to make a project. Both have a passion also for food. We said, what happens if we bring our skill sets literally to the table? Through lots of ideation, sketch modeling, prototyping, not shown here, Ken asked me about it. There was a bread dough thing for a while. We came up with this idea, which said, this is the instrument of taste. Our bodies are the instrument of taste. What if we found a way to play that? And so Lickestra, as you see here, is a series of ice cream cones. These are rapid prototype cones. Embedded within that is sensory technology. When ice cream is placed into it, ice cream is conductive. And so here, we pop people into these pedestals as a little bit of a riff on like the art gallery pedestal bust. You get it, right? They're in here. And they start to lick. And the second that your tongue touches it, it makes a sound. And so what happens is that every cone has a different sound. And as you play together, as you play with your bodies, you start to play with each other, and you play with your food. That leads me to this final statement. Food has been one of the greatest discoveries and greatest journeys that I've been on. I've learned so much about myself. I continue to learn about different cultures, different processes. It's something that I've also brought into a teaching practice. I teach food design workshops as well as a food design course at Pratt Institute. This is a workshop that we do in collaboration with Les SAD, the School of Art and Design in Reims, outside of Paris, and bring students to discover different traditions, techniques of another culture, and then they take that inspiration and make their own food designs. This is actually a foldable Turkish breakfast in our bottom corner over here. And together, I think something that I think of a lot is that what food does is it allows us to make together. A lot of the projects that I've shown you are collaborative. Why? Because I like people. Food likes people. And people need to like people. And working in this way, when we start to use food as a tool for creativity, when we use it as a tool for design, we start to learn so much about each other. And we start to see that it exists in all these different dimensions. It works as an artifact. It works as memory. It facilitates community, X, Y, and Z. This journey that I've been on has taught me so much about the boundaries of food and the ways that we can push it, provoke it, and use it to our advantage. And I think now we can almost say, and I think we can say, and we must say, that it is design. Because it doesn't just exist on a plate. It never has. And now we're starting to detail and diagram out all the other landscapes that food can affect. This is a quote by Paola Antonelli, the design curator at the MoMA in New York. And she says, it goes without saying that when the materials of design are not plastics, wood, ceramics, or glass, but rather living beings or living tissues, the implications of every project reach far beyond the form-function equation and any idea of comfort, modernity, or progress. And that is the landscape that we're looking at now. No longer this, but this. And for all of us who work in this discipline, in whatever capacity, I think it's important to start acknowledging all the different pieces, and for all of us to work together to try to map out this world that surrounds us, because this is our most precious material that we have. And I'm so excited to be able to share these coming days with you, and I thank you all and look forward to discovering more how we can illustrate this world together. Thank you.